Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, Som Kal. And before I begin speaking, I'm going to bring these for myself. They're here if anyone needs them. The first funeral I ever attended was in February of 1996. It was for a woman that I knew in an undergraduate named Sarah Duker. We were in the same friend group, and for a while I had a crush on her. A few years later, she had met a rabbinical student from the Jewish Theological Seminary and had fallen in love. They had been in Israel that year as part of his studies. A petite, intensely shy 23-year-old from Teaneck, New Jersey, Sarah, when I knew her, often wore a hat and was very religiously observant. That November, Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, had been assassinated, leaving the peace process in shambles. But still, there was optimism and newly opened borders, especially with Jordan. Sarah and Matt, trying to take advantage of that opportunity, had boarded the number 18 bus that Sunday morning to head off to catch a bus to Petra. For those of you who know, on Sunday morning, that's the start of the work week in Israel. The bus was crowded and noisy, and few people noticed a person coming on with a strange package, a book bag. When the bomb exploded, it killed Sarah and Matt, along with 23 others, injuring scores more. A few days later, over 1,000 people packed into the large conservative synagogue in Stamford, Connecticut, where Matt's family lived. This was the first time I had ever witnessed the Jewish mourning rituals. After several psalms and speakers, Sarah's mom spoke about how she pictured her daughter and her future son-in-law holding hands in their final moment. I, along with everyone else, was completely numb. 7 years later, in the summer of 2002, I lost two more friends, Marla Bennett and Ben Bluestein, to a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. They were killed at the bombing of Frank Sinatra Cafe on the campus of Hebrew University. They were eating lunch between classes, studying to become Jewish educators. This one was even more personal to me. I had spent the entire year before studying with both Marla and Ben at Pardes, a liberal Orthodox. I know it's an oxymoron, but they exist. A liberal Orthodox yeshiva around near the German colony. Marla had sat by me almost every day in our Torah class. From San Diego, she was sweet and quiet, with short cropped hair and a big smile. I remember that she always lined up a row of colored pencils before class. She said she wanted the pages of the Torah and the Talmud to be colorful. Ben and I were closer friends. He was from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is where my mother's family was from. And we had many, many people in common. He had even attended the Shiva for my grandfather the year before. An aspiring DJ, he was loud and boisterous and full of life. He told the head of our yeshiva, "I never spin on Shabbos." He would literally, and I got to watch him in Israel. I got to watch him in Jerusalem. He was learning how to do it, bring all of his records, and he would be there spinning all night and then come to yeshiva in the morning to study. They were both in their early 20s. When I learned the news, the pain was indescribable. I was at a large Jewish conference in New Hampshire. We held an impromptu service for them. I wrote poetry in their memory, wondering how could this have happened? Who could have perpetrated something so evil? As the week of mourning went by, I remember this strong feeling emerging from within me. If this was a test between the bomber's vision of the world, full of cynicism and hatred, and my friend's vision, full of love, life, and hope, I didn't want the bomber's vision to be the one that won out. I wanted it to be my friend's vision. In my estimation, if I let anger and revenge consume me, then the bomber would have won. If I stayed stuck in the moment of their death, the bomber would have won. But if I used the memory of my friends to fuel me to do acts of loving kindness, to live out the values that they had exhibited in their too short life, to become a better person, then my friends would have won. I didn't want the images of destroyed buildings and mangled bodies to be what I thought of when I pictured my friends. I wanted it to be their smiling faces and all the good times that we shared together. And I actually brought some pictures. Back then, they didn't have a lot of cell phone use, so this not too much online, but this is my friend Ben. This is Marla. And this is Matt and Sarah. When October 7th happened, all those feelings I had and those difficult times came flooding back to me. Only this was worse, much worse. The news was inescapable. Every day there were more and more horror stories. Wasn't just a few dozen people, but thousands. And not just killed, but held hostage as well. As an act of self-preservation, I didn't want to look at what I was seeing in the news. I didn't want to be consumed by anger and revenge. I didn't want the terrorist vision to win out. So for most of this past year, I have tried my best to keep the distance from what was going on. From the news and social media and even conversations with friends. But as stories from October 7th flooded in, the names and faces of the hostages and those who were lost on that day kept popping up everywhere I went. At night, before I went to bed, Ashira would remind me of stories she had heard that day. One of her Israeli friend's brothers, Tal Elon, was killed protecting his family at Kibbutz Kfar Aza. And actually, her friend knows that we're speaking about him and remembering him on this day. She would tell me of the youngest hostage, baby Kfir, a 7-month-old, who was kidnapped along with his 4-year-old brother, Ariel. She told me about a pregnant woman, a newly married couple, and a Holocaust survivor who were all being held hostage. As hard as I tried, it was impossible to look away. One name in particular came up more than others, again and again and again. I think a lot of you are familiar, Hirsch Goldberg Pollen. He was one of the 251 abducted. He and his best friend Aner were at the Nova Music Festival celebrating his 23rd birthday that occurred a few days before that. As terrorists swarmed the festival, they quickly scrambled into a nearby shelter to bunker themselves in. Somewhere around this time, he texted his parents, "I love you." And later, "I'm sorry." News had already begun to spread throughout Israel, and he must have known they were scared to death. And for good reason, as he texted, the terrorists were slinging grenades into their bunker. Each time, Aner and Hirsch would sling them right back. 7 times this happened, and on the 8th time, the grenade exploded, killing Aner and blowing off of Hirsch's left arm to the elbow. He fastened a makeshift tourniquet to stop the bleeding. A video taken at the scene showed Hirsch being carted off in a pickup truck. A joyful young man, Hirsch was a symbol of everything right about the world. For 329 days, he languished underground, malnourished, tortured, only to be killed along with 5 others the last day of August as IDF soldiers approached overhead. After 11 months in captivity, he was mere minutes away from being rescued. As much as I wanted to look away, to not let his story really seep into me, I couldn't, because every day around the world, his parents, John and Rachel, were sharing his story. A quiet family, they put themselves out there, not just to free Hirsch, but to free all the hostages. They shared his story over and over again. They shared it to journalists in Israel, where I was at the March of Israel, March for Israel in Washington, D.C., with the Pope, and even at the Democratic National Convention. Each time they ended with a message. Hirsch, if you can hear us, we love you. Stay strong. Survive. And when they shared his story, they not only shared about their son's abduction, but they shared about the entirety of his life. They shared about his early childhood growing up in the Bay Area. How at 3 years old, Hirsch would grill them on the toughest of life questions as they walked to get coffee. How as a kindergartner, he knew so many facts about U.S. presidents, he would actually charge adults for answers to them. How when they decided to make Aliyah as a family when Hirsch was only 7 years old, he wanted to retain his name, even if Israelis would have trouble pronouncing it. They shared about a time in 6th grade in Israel when he learned about the many Africans seeking asylum. You could see them up and down the roads in Tel Aviv. And Hirsch insisted on going to rallies and taking his parents and sisters to rallies on their behalf. He even went after one of these rallies. He scoped out his home looking for a hiding place for them, and he found it in the dishwasher. He said, "We can hide two here." They also spoke about his love of traveling, going to music festivals, about how the summer before he was abducted last summer, he had gone by himself to 6 different music festivals in 6 different countries. By himself. And more importantly, they spoke about what a good person he was, curious about the world. He would engage with anyone, anywhere. As his father John said, Hirsch was always seeking to understand the other, always with dignity and respect. Each time his parents shared his story, Hirsch would come alive to me a little bit more. His picture began to shine even in my dreams. John and Rachel were more than just random strangers in the world. They had become like family members. And each time they spoke, it was not a message full of hate, but full of love. I have their picture here with me too. This is John and Rachel and Hirsch before the summer before. At his funeral in early September, just about a month ago, they spoke not out of anger and spite, but barely referenced October 7th at all. Instead, they focused on how much their son meant to them. Here's what Rachel said at the funeral. "I've had a lot of time the past 332 days to think about my sweet boy, my Hirsch. And one thing I keep thinking about is how out of all the mothers in the world, God chose to give Hirsch to me. What must I have done in a past life to deserve such a beautiful gift? It must have been glorious. For 23 years, I was privileged to have this most stunning treasure, to be Hirsch's mama. I'll take it and say thank you. I just wish it had been a little longer." And from John, "The 23 years of life that we had with you were a blessing. We will now work to make your legacy a similar blessing. You were a really great guy. I love you." Each of the roughly 1,200 people who lost their lives on October 7th and the 251 more who were abducted, 101 of which are still in captivity, 101, has a face and a story. Each of them has people who love them and who will miss them the rest of the days of their life. Each of them has left an imprint on this world, no matter how big or small. Each of them deserves to have their story shared, not only about their deaths, but about their lives. The traditional Torah portion for Yom Kippur is from Acharei Mot, a portion that means after the death. In it, we see Aaron, a proud papa. It must have been a tremendous and overwhelming grief, have to struggle to fulfill his role as high priest because his eldest sons, his heirs, Nadab and Abihu, had been taken from him in a tragic sacrificial accident. Trying to emulate their father, they took what was deemed a foreign fire, an Eish Zarah, up to the altar and were suddenly struck down. While no specific time frame is given for our chosen reading for today, we imagine that it is occurring in the days and weeks after the accident. In his time of mourning, Aaron now must somehow put what happened to his sons behind him to fulfill his duty as high priest. This is the context of the ritual of the scapegoat, the ritual of Yom Kippur, the central service for this day, where in front of the entirety of the people, Aaron must take 2 goats, one as a sacrifice and one to be sent out into the wilderness. In the portion itself, we are told nothing about what Aaron must have been actually going through on this day, nothing about the extreme pain he must have been in, what he must have been thinking or feeling in that moment, how each step must have been excruciating, how each action must have been a knife in his heart. We only see him walk step by step towards the altar, the same altar his sons were killed on to fulfill his duty as high priest. Every year I read this, I want to scream at Aaron to stop, to tend to his own needs, to be given the space to grieve that any parent who loses a child fully deserves. But in my heart of hearts, I understand Aaron would not have wanted this. He is not performing these rites and rituals to deaden the memory of his sons, but rather to keep their memory alive. Our tradition teaches us that above everything else, we should always bachor chaim, choose life. Choosing life means being generous with our hearts, believing in the overall goodness of humanity and not demonizing our most fervent enemies. The terrorists win when we begin to see the world as black and white, when we cannot look with compassion at people suffering, including and most especially Palestinians. We may hate Hamas, but we cannot close up our hearts to the tremendous loss of life in Gaza. That is what Hirsch would have wanted. That is what we owe all the victims of this awful day, of that awful day. Several years after the bombing of Bus 18, I went back to my alma mater, the Jewish Theological Seminary. It was Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah. We know about Simchat Torah now. The most joyous of all holidays, the day we parade with our Torahs through the halls of our synagogue and the streets of our cities. I remember going into the basement of the seminary and seeing a room that had been dedicated in the memory of my friends, the Matthew Eisner and Sarah Duker Beit Midrash study hall. The tears of their loss still burned in my soul, but the suffering was eased by the enthusiasm of the holiday. We danced in circles, raising the Torahs high above our heads, exactly as Matt and Sarah would have done in their all too short lives. There's a saying that the survivors of the Nova Music Festival have been sharing, and I actually heard it from Tomer and Cheval, who are here, that will share our stories in just a little while. We will dance again. We will dance again. By dance again, they mean live again, full of life and love, just like they did prior to October 7th. When I close my eyes to think of my friends, I do not think of the horror of how they died. I imagine the joy of how they lived, their faces beaming with pride at the way their memories have been shared from one person to the next. This is just their pictures again. That's Matt and Sarah again. Marla. Ben. And John, Rachel, and Hirsch. The names of the bombers have been lost to the sands of time. In this ways, my friends have won. We all have. I conclude with the words that Hirsch's father, John, has begun to use each time he talks about his son. Not Yehi Zikrono Livracha. May his memory be for a blessing. but Yehi Zikrano Lemahapecha. May his memory be for a revolution. By revolution, he means something different than the normal way we use the word. He means a shofar blast to wake up the world, to make it better, not through violence and war, but through friendship and cooperation. Not through hatred and enmity, but through love and friendship. This is how we will truly honor the memory of my friends. This is how we will ensure their memories are always for a blessing. On this Day of Atonement, please join me in saying, Yehi Zikronam Mahapecha. May their memories be for a revolution. May all of us be written and sealed in the book of a life well lived. Hashana Tova Umetuka Yoter. A good year, a sweet year, a better year. We'll take a moment of silence just to collect our thoughts.